right, so Roman numeral 2, working class unrest. So if you look at the picture that you see on the slide, we see workers in the distance, and they are in rebellion. And who is killing them? Businesses have hired the United States government to send in the army or to send in state militia to kill these workers. We have said this before in our last lecture, that this is supposed to be a time of laissez-faire, the government being hands off. But the government is very laissez-faire in some respects, is that the government will come in and actually aid business during some labor strikes. And so we do see the government hands-on as far as protecting business, promoting business. Because the government is the people that are paying these troops to come in and kill the workers. All over the United States, as we'll find out. All right. And so we're going to see this working class. Now, why are these workers so upset? What did I show you on the last lecture? What is going on with the wealth gap in America? It's increasing. And so these people in the distance, that's part of the 98%, 90% of America that is struggling and fighting over what percent of the wealth? 10% of the wealth. A wealth gap is increasing in America, and these people are angry because their lives are so miserable, and so they're protesting. And then the government's going to come in and squash the protest. All right. And so let's go to the next slide. Letter A, labor unions. So what is a labor union? What is a labor union? What's labor? It's workers. That's exactly right. And a union is where people come together. Now, we talked about this a long time ago when we started to talk about the first labor unions during the market revolution. Why is it safer to come together to ask your boss for something?
Strength in numbers.
Strength in numbers. If it's just one of you, well, you're fired. But if it's all of you, I'm not going to fire you all because, well, I don't want to shut down my whole factory. That costs me money. And so we're going to talk a lot about labor unions. Workers coming together, there's strength in numbers. Right? And so number one, why join a union? What could be so miserable that these people would want to join together and join a union? Now, when you join a union, we're going to find out it's dangerous as a worker. You could be fired for joining a union. Plus, the union takes money out of your paycheck, which is already small, because they have to pay their lawyers and they have to pay their negotiators and they have to, have their secretaries be paid. And so why would anybody willingly take money out of their own paycheck to support a union? Look at these pictures. Whether it's the miners in the top right-hand corner or the women in the textile mill, or I think they're actually shucking oysters maybe, in the bottom. Why would these workers, what would they want that a union could help them get? Shorter hours. That's exactly right. Shorter hours. Right? And so if we look at this, and low wages, let's start with actually wages. In 1900, the average yearly wage was $490. And so that's the next part of the slide. $490. That's not much to survive on. And so if you're trying to feed your family, you might go to your boss and say, hey, can we have a pay raise? And what is the boss going to say? No. What is the purpose of a company? To make money, not to take care of its employees, right? The main purpose of a company actually being is to make money. And so, of course, your boss is going to say no, right? The next thing is we have long hours, right? We see, on average, people work 60 hours a week. That's a lot. And so let's talk about why this is. Let's say you own a business, and you want that business to only operate 8 hours a day or 24 hours a day. Why? More money, right? If that factory is just sitting there not working, you're losing money. And so you want that factory to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Because you want to make as much product as you can to make money. And so if you could just hire one group of workers to work one 24-hour shift every day, that would be amazing. You only have to hire one group of workers, but human beings will die if you try to work them all the time. That's a failing of ours. Right? And so instead of working one shift, how many shifts would you do? 2. Which means how long are their shifts? 12-hour days. What's 12 times 5? 60. That's how we get that 60-hour number. And so we see these people working 12-hour shifts. Now, if you ever worked a 12-hour shift, you know it's really long. Especially working in a mine or working in a factory, all bent over, doing something laborious and very hands-on. It's going to be really hard work. Now, why wouldn't these owners just hire 3 shifts? How many hours in a day would that be if you had 3 shifts? 8. Thank you for your advanced math, right? 8. And so today, that's what most workers work. They work 8-hour shifts. but that's going to cost me, the factory owner, more because instead of just 2 groups of workers I have to pay, now I have to pay 3, and that costs more money, right? And so we see factory owners want 2 shifts of 12 hours apiece. Of course, that's great for the factory. It's not great for the workers. That's a long day. And so they will join a union to try to get the holy grail. In fact, it's actually even called this. The holy grail of labor unions is an 8-hour day, right? 8 hours to rest, 8 hours to work, and 8 hours to improve yourself or spend time with your family, right? And so they certainly want that. They're not going to get it, though, for a long time. All right. Next, we see unsafe working conditions. Yes?
So when talking about, so if you're working 12-hour shifts, wouldn't you, slow down your production?
No, because your boss is behind you yelling at you to go as fast as you possibly can. I'll give you an example. In college, I worked at a factory, and it's on an assembly line, and we were shrink wrapping movies. So here comes the movies down the assembly line at a really fast clip. It was my job to lower this machine that would put plastic around it and then heat it up and shrink it. So when you're in a store and you buy a movie or a DVD or something, it has that plastic on the outside. That was my job. And so the boss is yelling at me to go as fast as possible to keep up with the factory because the more he produces in an hour, the more money he makes, right? And so he wants me to go as fast as possible, which sometimes led to accidents on my part. Because I'm going so fast, I got to put this thing in the machine, clamp the shrink wrap machine down, which was hot, to make that plastic melt, and then send it off before the next one came down. And sometimes I didn't get my hand out of the way. I had to center the movie, and that thing came down on my hand, and I burned my hand. Right? I complained about it to my boss. He said, complain again and you're fired. Right? And so we see, do companies want to put in safety precautions? They don't want to slow that assembly line down. They don't want to put in a safety rail or a safety guard. That's going to cost them money. There was also very little lighting up above where I was working on that factory line, and so I couldn't see very well, and so sometimes that was a reason for some of my accidents. And I said, am I going to tell my boss to put in another light? He'll fire me. And why doesn't he want to put in another light? That will cost him money. And the purpose of a business is to make money. And so we see unsafe working conditions. That's another reason people come together. According to your slide, how many people died in 1913 alone? 25,000 fatalities. That's not injured. That's deaths. This is like warlike numbers, right? 25,000 people in 1 year died on the job. Obviously, in 1913, which is a little bit outside the Gilded Age, but it's still close enough, that we see it's a very dangerous place. And why don't employers care? What do we have a surplus of? Workers. So if one worker dies, that's okay. There's always more workers. And the government is not there to regulate them, to tell them you've got to put in safety requirements. Because who is controlling the government at this point? The business owners. Right? So certainly not the labor unions. All right, next. This is also a reason why people want to join unions. Because you could lose your job at any time. So look through that list. Is there anything on there that you're not clear of? Why you could lose your job? Right? If you get sick, can you call in sick? No? Because that's going to cost the boss money. Look, you show up to work, and if you don't, you're fired. Because you're not being at work costs me money. So you got to be at work. Right? You could have an accident on the job, and it's completely your boss's fault. But he doesn't care. Let's say you lose an arm. What is he going to do? He's going to fire you. What do I need with a one-armed worker on an assembly line? Right? And so you can lose your job at any time because of you getting sick, your family member getting sick, an accident, right? Job competition. Somebody is always out there willing to work for less. And who do you think this group is? Immigrants. Immigrants are just off the boat, and they are desperate. Their families are starving, and they are willing to work for less than you. And so the ironic thing is, who becomes nativist during this time? Former immigrants. If you came here 2 years ago to America, and you've got a job, who do you not want coming to America? More immigrants. They're willing to work for less than you. And so we're going to see nativism at this time, of course, anti-immigration, and it's usually labor unions who don't like immigrants because it'll force working wages down. And then technology. You're looking at maybe the last generation of teachers, right? How can my job be go away in the future? Just what we're doing right now, recording lectures and putting them online. And then can you not take high school online? You can take college online, right? You never have to actually see a human being. You can just, do it this way. And so certainly, maybe my job in the future will be replaced by technology. But let's say that you're a shoemaker at this time. What could replace you? Some machine, right? And so you could lose your job, not just to new immigrants, but to machines that never need a break, that don't have to ever get paid, right? So it's a brave new world out there. Machines replacing all of us, right? And then the market swing. Every 20 years, make sure you write this down, every 20 years we're going to have a depression or a crash, right? And so when that happens, if I own a factory, what am I going to do to save costs if people aren't buying my goods anymore? I'm going to cut workers' wages first, and then if that still doesn't work, I'm going to cut workers. And so at any time you can lose your job for accident, illness, technology, or market swings. Yes? That just seems to be the cycle of the economy in the United States, right? We could ask an economist, but that seems to be throughout our history, every 20 years we have a crash. So we're good until, what, 2028 in your prime earning years? All right, next. And so why do workers come together? To get change. To get these things we've listed on this slide improved. So this slide has all the reasons why people join unions. Now the next 4 slides-ish are going to be all the reasons why unions don't work. Right? And so obviously this is not going to be a time where labor unions are going to have a lot of success. If it's 4 slides or so of labor unions not working. So number 2, unions are weakened by, first thing is ethnic divisions. What you see on your slide is a picture of African American workers and a picture of Italian workers. I could have also put Irish workers. If I'm Irish, remember during the Civil War, I did some riots because I didn't want to free African Americans. Why not? The fear is they'll come up north and they'll take our jobs. And so let's say I'm trying to organize a union. I have a factory and it's half African American, half Irish. And I have them come together and I say, together, united, we will form a union and we'll go on strike together. And the Irishmen and the African Americans say, I'm not getting a union with that guy. Just because of racism. Right? And what is the only way a union can be successful? Strength in numbers. Plus, you have to trust each other. My first year teaching, I was in a union. I was teaching in Denver Public Schools, and I was in a union, and we went on strike. And I had to trust my fellow workers. Because that first day of the strike, if I didn't go to work, but everybody else did, who's getting fired? I am. Right? And so there has to be trust in a union. And these groups of people don't trust each other. But we could also put Italians and Jews. Or we could put Irishmen and Polish guys, right? We see all of these ethnic divisions, people coming into America, and they simply don't trust each other. So that makes it hard to create a union. All right, next thing, the belief that the job is temporary. What did I say unions take out of your paycheck? Money. Does anybody here work for King Soopers or Albertsons, Safeway, some grocery store? I usually have that happen, right? So when I asked them, I said, do you belong in the union? They say yes, and they're very disgusted by it, right? Because they don't want to be in a union, because the union takes money out of their paycheck. But then I say to them, well, the union's going to help you get more pay in the long run. Like, what do I care about that? I'm a teenager. Do you think any of these teenagers think this is their career? No. Shopping cart retrieval of shopping carts or bagging bags. No. A lot of these people who were living in the Gilded Age, they didn't believe that this was their permanent job either. Look, why am I going to join a union? First of all, I might get fired for joining a union. Second of all, it's not my permanent job. What do I care about more pay in the future? I'm only here for a couple of months, maybe a year max, and then I'm going to move on to something better. In many cases, that never happened. They always kind of stayed in that low-end job. But that's something that keeps unions from being formed. People don't want to join it for that reason. Next, we have skilled versus unskilled workers. Right? What is a skilled worker? Don't say somebody who has skills. What's a skilled worker?
Someone who can't be replaced easily by machinery.
There you go. Somebody who cannot be replaced either by machinery or another human being. So is anybody in here a lifeguard? Right? We have one lifeguard. What did you have to do to become a lifeguard? You had to take some lessons, you had to get certified, and you have to get some Red Cross thing or whatever, right? Can your boss easily fire you and just replace you with somebody on the street? No, right? And so typically when I ask teenagers who has a job and what you get paid, somebody is always a lifeguard, and they say, I would get paid, like $9 an hour or something like that, maybe 10, whatever. And then I ask somebody else, well, what do you do? And last period I had somebody who, he washes cars for a living. And he gets paid $5 and then tips, right? Why does the lifeguard get paid more than the guy who wax on, wax off?
Because anyone can do this, but not everyone.
Yeah, anybody can wash a car. Not everybody has a license to save people. And so that's skilled versus unskilled, right? So if I have a skill, if I'm a teacher, you have to have a certificate to be a teacher. You have, let's say, some skill to be a teacher. Why am I not going to join a union with the car wash guy? We want different things. That's exactly right. And I'm not willing to go on strike for somebody who can only wax on, wax off. Why should I put my family in danger of starvation for somebody who can only do a menial labor job? And so we see this split in unions between skilled versus unskilled. We'll talk about that a lot more in this lecture. If you look at the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, what skilled job is that we still don't have machines that can do this very well? Rolling cigars, right? If you roll a cigar too tight, it breaks the tobacco leaf. If you don't roll it tight enough, I'm told it's not a good smoke because I don't smoke, right? And so the Cigar Rollers of America, we'll talk more about them later, actually. They're a union we're going to talk about. Yes?
Are the union workers, the people in the union, are they from like the same company or from the same job?
What a great question. There's a difference. Some of them are from the same company. Some of them will be the same job or industry. That will be determined. We'll talk about unions and how they're organized. Some are organized by company, some are organized by job, some are organized by industry. So good question. We'll talk about that later. Yes?
So does a union give them better pay, give them better hours, or is it just
that's their
them
goal,
coming together?
right? So they'll come together, and what is a labor union's number one weapon to get what they want? To go on strike. What is the only thing you as a worker control in capitalism? Control of your labor. You don't control raw materials. You don't own the factory. You don't have the money. All you have is labor. And so you withhold the one thing you have, labor. And so they will go on strike. Sometimes they're successful, and the boss will say, okay, fine, you get more pay. At this time, a lot of the times they are unsuccessful. Who do you think is going to be more successful, skilled strikes or unskilled strikes?
Skilled.
You're 100% right. Skilled strikes would be a lot more successful. So make sure you write that down. All right, next slide. Unions weakened by continued. What else will keep unions from being successful? Right. First is the government. Right? The government, when we see this picture here on the right, there's going to be a railroad strike. The railroad workers want more pay, better, safer working conditions, etc. And when they strike, that railroad company, who do they have in their back pocket that they can go to and say, hey, send in troops, kill these workers, put them back to work? The government. That's exactly right. The government helps the railroads. The government will come in, the state government, the national government, the local government. They will send in the militia or the police or the army, and they will force these workers to go back to work. So let me ask you this. Is this a time of laissez-faire where the government completely keeps its hands off of business? They help railroad companies get land and loans, and they also help companies with their labor issues. They send in troops. The next thing you see on your slide is the big stop sign, right? And what is that called when the government says to stop something? It's called an injunction. It's a fancy way for the court to say, cease and desist, stop, right? An injunction. Junction, what's your function? I want you to write this down in your notes. It's silly, but so is high school. Junction, what's your function? Breaking up strikes and labor unions. Junction, what's your function?
Breaking up labor
Strikes and labor unions. There you go. Okay. All right. And so that's it. So let's say there's a strike going on, and we don't want to send in troops. How can we stop the strike? Just you go to your local judge that you've helped get elected, or you paid for, or you give a bribe to, and you say, hey, local judge, put an injunction on this strike. And then They have to go back to work. If you're a labor union striking and the court says you have to stop the strike, injunction, if you don't go back to work, guess what they do? They send you to jail. It's either work or jail. Does that sound like that's one of your civil rights being violated? You bet. We talked about this during Reconstruction with African Americans. You either sign a labor contract, you go to work, or you go to jail. What was that? The Black Codes. So while that's going on in the South, in the rest of the country, we have these injunctions. So this certainly is a time, whether it's in the South or the North, where the people with money have a lot of power and the people without money don't. All right. The next thing is we see the 14th Amendment. Right? The 14th Amendment was this idea that African Americans are citizens. You can read the text with me. It says, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States." That was supposed to give African Americans civil rights. But let's lift the word citizens and let's put in the word businesses. That's what the Supreme Court did. They said that businesses are people and they are protected by the law. And so if that's the case, let's say the voters get upset with these big, strong, powerful businesses. Can the government do anything to regulate these businesses and force them to give workers higher pay? Because what will the company say? You're violating my 14th Amendment right. The ironic thing is that nobody thinks forcing workers back to work is a violation of their rights. But it is if you're a business and they're saying you have to pay workers more. Because this is the Gilded Age. This is the age where who supports business? Who supports the government? Let me rephrase. Who supports business? There you go. All right. Question.
Can you go back a little? Sorry.
Yeah.
What? Government not doing?
The government will not regulate. Right? The government will not tell business you have to do this, something negative. Because the business say, you're violating my 14th Amendment right. Businesses are people. You can't tell me that I have to pay my workers more. You can't tell me that I have to give them safer working conditions because you're not giving me my due process. You're not treating me as a citizen. Right? The last thing on this slide is the Sherman Antitrust Act. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide for that. Right? The Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act was created to bust up trusts. Whose trust in particular? Come on, think of the last lecture.
Big businesses.
So whose trust in particular? He was an oil guy. Rockefeller, right? And so the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, dates are important. Section 1, every contract, combination in the form of a trust or otherwise or conspiracy, and make sure you write this down in your notes, in restraint of trade, is illegal. So if you have a company that is completely in control of an industry, so much so that you can control or restrain trade, you get to just set the prices. The United States government is saying, we are going to bust you up. We're going to take your company and divide it into a bunch of little companies. Let me give you an example of this. Give me a telephone company today. Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint. You get the idea. A lot of these companies were originally one company. They were something called Ma Bell, right? They were a big telephone company. And it was one big company. Now, it got so big and so powerful that what could they charge Americans for telephone service? Almost as much as they wanted. And so the United States government said, Sherman Antitrust Act, this is in restraint of trade. You are not allowing competition to happen. And so they busted up into many of the companies that you just listed. Why is that good for consumers? They have to compete for your business, lower prices, better services. But this is the Gilded Age. The United States government is not going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act for the way it was designed. Yes, it was designed to bust up companies. But do you think we're going to have the government tell business they can't do things? Not in this age. And so who is the Sherman Antitrust Act used against, if not big business? Labor unions. They're using it in a way it wasn't intended. Instead, what they say is that unions, if unions get too big, they say unions are in restraint of trade. You're monopolizing the whole labor industry. And so they threaten to destroy labor unions with the Sherman Antitrust Act. Was that what its intent was?
No.
But that's what we're using it, because this is the Gilded Age, and big business is supported by the United States government. Either through the 14th Amendment, the Sherman Antitrust Act, troops, or the injunction. So before we move on, any questions about that? Yes?
So the Sherman Antitrust Act is
Make what illegal? It makes big unions illegal. So this is just another tool businesses have in their little tool belt to go and bust up a union if they think it's too big, too powerful, things they don't like. Yes?
The bottom of the slide mentions a court case. What happened?
So we're talking about Eugene v. Debs versus Pullman. Eugene v. Debs, we'll talk more about this later, but Eugene v. Debs is going to lead a huge labor union strike. Now, he's a socialist, so he's pretty committed to workers. And the United States government is going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to bust up the strike, and they send Eugene v. Debs to jail. Right? And so we see that the Sherman Antitrust Act is being used to put injunctions on strikes. Pullman means that's the name of the strike. So we'll talk about the Pullman strike later. Big strike, and certainly it's an example of the government taking the side of big business.
I thought it was a court case because usually when there's like a name.
Oh yeah, the V? No, that's just his middle name.
That's right. No, that's
Yeah, his name is Eugene v. Debs. It's not Eugene versus Debs. All right. So unions weakened by continued. Yellow dog contracts. A yellow dog contract, yellow means cowardly, right? A dog is not a good thing to be called. And so let's say that you want to work for a company, and the company says, look, I'll hire you, but you have to promise, as a part of our condition of employment, you're going to sign a contract that says as long as you work for me, you won't join a union. That's a yellow dog contract. This is a way for businesses to keep unions from even forming in their company. Is this a way to weaken unions?
Yes.
Yes. Of course, it's called a yellow dog contract because union workers, they think this is bad, this is horrible. Don't sign it, you're a coward. Right? Don't go to work for them if they're not going to let unions happen. Yes.
Can you explain that?
So again, a yellow dog contract is where businesses are forcing workers to say that I will never join a union as long as I work for this company. That's a yellow dog contract. We're going to keep unions from even starting to form. Next, we have ironclad oaths. Do you remember this from your Reconstruction study cards? An ironclad oath means, in this case, that you not only will not join a union, yellow dog contract, but you actually never have been in a union. So it's an even more stringent oath if you want to work for me. So why would this discourage people from ever joining unions?
Because it's hard to find a job.
Yeah, if you ever get fired and you've been in a union, you'll never find another job and your family will starve. These are pretty powerful. That's why it's under intimidation. Next, lockouts. Does anybody remember this happened in professional sports all the time? A lockout, the NBA lockout, the NHL lockout, etc. A lockout is kind of the opposite of a strike. It is the owners shutting down their factory on purpose and locking out their employees. Now, why would they do this? Because they've heard that their workers are trying to form a union. So this is a preemptive strike, right? When you're a factory owner and you've heard your workers are trying to form a union, you shut down the factory, you lock them out, and you say, look, we are not going to let you guys come back and get your jobs again until you give up this silly talk of joining a union. Who has more money? Who will not starve to death? The factory owners. And so they are locking the workers out until they give in and they say, okay, we won't join a union. That's a lockout. Right? And what we see in the picture is a very famous lockout. Do you see the factory in the background? And then the fence is around it, and so the workers are trying to get in. To some extent, we'll talk more about the specific picture, and they can't because the owners have locked them out until they give up their demands of a union. All right, a blacklist. Besides being a TV show, what is blacklist? A blacklist is not a list you want to be on. It's a list that means that if you're a troublemaker, if you join a union or you try to start a union, your name will be put on that list and it will be circulated around all the other factory owners in the state. And what will they refuse to do? Hire you. So you'll never get a job now. So this is a way of intimidating people, keeping them from joining unions.
So it's just a list?
It's a list with names on it. And then if your name's on it, you won't get hired. And also descriptions too, in case you go by a different name. All right, next slide. So our next few slides are about specific unions. So before we get into that, any questions Could you write an essay about various ways that unions had a real tough time getting going? So if I were to ask you a question on your essay, on your next test, an essay question, to what extent were unions successful? Could you give me a whole bunch of reasons why they weren't successful?
Yes.
Okay, right. And so when we come back, we'll talk about the National Labor Union, and we'll go through a whole bunch of unions, but this is a good place to stop.